Hello. I'm going to talk about some more brainstorming for the book that I'm writing. I'm still leaning toward titling the book The One, the All, and the Mystery, but my only reservation is that if I call it The One, the All, and the Mystery, I feel like I would need three different sections. One section, like the first section about the one, the second section about the all, and the third section about the mystery. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's mandatory. I mean, obviously it's not mandatory, but like something feels off about titling it that and then not following that structure in the book. But maybe it would still work out. Whenever I'm writing down notes, I still just say OAM, the one, the all, and the mystery, like OAM notes, OAM notes. And I have over 10 notebooks of research, notes, commentary, reflection for this book. So it's something I'm excited about. It's something it's still going to take a months for me to finish. And it's the book that I've devoted the most time and energy to out of any book I've ever written. And just like any other project, it's easy sometimes to, when I feel like I need to keep working on it, and if I'm not working on it actively on any given specific week, I'll start feeling bad about that. But then when I start feeling bad about that, I will, feel that obligation. I'll place that, I feel this sense of obligation within myself to work on it. And it's useful and important to have a sense of discipline, I think. But it's also useful and important to not perceive the things that you have discipline about in your life. I guess I shouldn't put it in the second person. In my life, it is important for me to not feel like things like writing projects, meditation practice, those sorts of things. It's important for me to not feel like they are a chore, to not feel like they are something it's like, oh crap, I have to knock this out. For me, it's much more empowering, exciting, and just enjoyable to always try to remember why I am drawn to doing that thing in the first place. Why am I drawn to write this book? Why am I excited about it? And then when I reflect on that, I'm like, oh my God, this is exciting. This is really cool. It's an act of discovery. It's an act of synthesis. It's a way of trying to condense down and express and communicate and make sense of, for myself and others, wisdom that I've learned from other people and from my own experience. And so when I buckle down to keep working on the OAM project, I harness discipline and also excitement and remembrance about why I'm doing it in the first place. I'm not doing it to be bored. I'm not doing it to feel obligated. I'm doing it ultimately out of a sense of enthusiasm, excitement, and passion. So for now, I've broken the book down into three sections. The first section is called Mystery, or The Mystery. And in that section, I am going to talk about, not necessarily in this order, but I'm going to be talking about infinity. I'm going to be talking about emptiness, mainly from a Buddhist perspective. I'm going to be talking about the Tao. I'm going to talk about interdependence. And, I'm going to bring up like the holographic model of the universe, as well as fractals and Indra's net when talking about interdependence. I'm going to talk about yin and yang, Shiva, Shakti, and I'm going to, kind of address certain passages from the Gnostic Gospels about God in part 1. So, yeah, I'm starting from the most macro. I'm starting from diving in, navigating, and trying to make sense of views about ultimate reality or the absolute. So I'm starting as macro as possible. Second section is called Awakening, and I'm going to talk about awakening from various perspectives as well. Gnosis, for example, Dzogchen, for example, knowledge by identity, and that art thou from an Advaita Vedanta perspective, that knowledge or realization that you are that art thou. Each of us is an expression of infinity, or an expression of the absolute, an expression of God. That's a huge part of awakening. But I feel like I'm not going to just limit awakening to that. I'm going to talk about Satori from a Buddhist perspective. I'm going to talk about not only awakening to that art thou, but also awakening to our own power, our own personal power, our own agency, our own ability to steer our life and curate our life in a way that is effective and healthy and empowering. And when I talk about that, I'm going to dip into neuroplasticity, the ability that we have to kind of reprogram our brains, basically. And I'm going to talk about, I'm going to use like the magician card in the tarot as one of many symbols for tapping into our own personal power and having will. But it's not as easy as to say that it's just like, oh, you have your own power. It's this, in the magician card, he has one hand pointed upward at infinity and another hand pointed downward toward the ground. And so it's this sense of the power, this infinite power that we have is given to us or gifted to us from absolute reality, from reality itself. And so we don't own it. It is not just... It's not something that an individual has to him or herself that other people don't have. Everybody has access to it. And so that power that is really important to tap into so we can start curating our lives and having more say in our own lives is part of the awakening that I'm going to talk about in part 2. And I'm also going to touch on awakening to interdependence. So, interdependence is going to be a theme that is stitched throughout the whole book in the first part, second, and third. I'm sure there will be several themes that appear in each section, but interdependence might be at the forefront of that, which makes complete sense. But yeah, so the second section, awakening, is going to talk about all three of those things. Awakening to the fact that each of us is an expression of the divine. Awakening to our own power that is gifted to us from the universe, so to speak. And also awakening to interdependence in the sense of awakening to the fact that we are interdependently intertwined with literally everything around us and far away, and nothing exists in isolation, nothing exists in a vacuum, everything is shaped by everything else. And that can be very healing to recognize, and it can be very activating um, as we bring our insights back into the world. Part 3 is rebirth. So we got the mystery, we got awakening, and then part 3 is rebirth. And obviously rebirth shows up in several different spiritual traditions. I guess most people would probably affiliate it most with Christianity, because it's like explicitly talked about a lot in Christianity. But I'm going to take definitely a more loose and holistic and inclusive approach to rebirth. I'm going to talk about it from various perspectives, as I as all the other sections come from a bunch of different angles. So, but the main thrust of part 3, the main notion that I have about rebirth is basically taking our awakening into the world and into our everyday lives on a day-to-day basis. It's like an awakening experience can be obviously really powerful and life-changing. But perhaps more importantly than individual awakening experiences is rebirth in the way that I'm talking about it in the book, which is, well, what do we do now? How do we preserve it? How do we practice in a way that's aligned with our awakening? And I had a kind of an insight that popped in my head the other day, which is rebirth is, it's like we're born into this world. So that's our first birth, is just our actual literal birth as an individual in this world. And then rebirth is the self that we choose. It's like we're being reborn from awakening and then choosing to live our life in a certain way that is aligned with our awakenings, and is kind of this down to earth, hands-on practice of constantly reminding ourselves of our own values, of the life that we want to lead. So in the rebirth chapter, I am going to dip into some Christian ideology and Christian symbolism, which the other two, I will talk about gnosis in part 2. So that's like a Gnostic Christian perspective. But as far as some of the kind of more standard Christian ideas that we think about, I'm going to dip most into those in part 3 out of all the parts. So I'm going to talk about forgiveness. I'm going to talk about even atonement, which I think of it as at-one-ment. Joseph Campbell put me onto that breakdown of the word. At one with our higher self, so to speak. That's how I think about atonement, is recognizing our sins. Sins, the etymology of that is missing the mark. Recognizing where we miss the mark, forgiving ourselves, forgiving others, and trying to atone in the sense of trying to transform our lives, trying to be more at one with our highest potential. I'm going to talk about the kingdom of heaven, and to me that is like tapping into the infinite surplus of wisdom, energy, love inside of us, and bringing it out into the world and seeing it in other people in the world, and creating communities and relationships that honor that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about politics in part 3. kind of like politics of love. How can we bring spiritual insight into the political sphere, into the social sphere? And I'm going to talk about the beginner's mind, because I feel like the beginner's mind is one really powerful tool of rebirth, in the sense that, like, when we continuously cultivate the beginner's mind, then we're always practicing, and we're kind of always reborn, because we're like never allowing ourselves to get too bogged down by our own assumptions or our own stubbornness or our own sense of I know all the answers and all that stuff. So like constantly seeing ourselves and others and the world and the universe through fresh eyes, which is to me a big part of the beginner's mind and rebirth. And I'm going to talk about Tantra some in chapter 3, like Tantra embodiment, kind of like honoring the embodied experience in the physical world as equally divine as like consciousness and things that transcend the physical world. And I think that's a big part of rebirth in my mind is embodiment. And I think Tantra has a lot of interesting things to say about that. I'm going to talk about magic. I know I mentioned the magician in part 2, but in part 3, I'm going to talk about New Thought, the New Thought movement, and New Thought techniques of selecting or manifesting things in our lives through certain techniques. And I'm going to, dive into all sorts of magic, magical practices. And Jason Louv, as I've mentioned on a previous video, defined magic in a certain podcast that has always stuck with me. He said that magic is dehypnotizing ourselves from our own powerlessness. So that's similar to what I was saying about part 2, the magician kind of recognizing their own power. And so as far as practice goes, magic can have a really potent effect on continuously harnessing our own agency in our lives. I guess that's the simplest way to put it, is making sure we're constantly harnessing our own agency in our lives. So I'm going to talk about that in part 3. And lastly, and obviously this was just a brief breakdown and there's so much more, but this was just kind of the skeleton of my vision so far. But yeah, lastly, the thing I'm going to talk about in part 3 is like self-development, individuation, that sort of thing. So I'm going to dive into like Carl Jung's idea of the big self, capital S self, and the ego and the shadow. I'm going to talk about shadow work a lot. I'm going to reference Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey with that. I'm going to reference Maslow's ideas about self-actualization. And so yeah, in part 3 I'm gonna bring part 1 starts most macro, part 3 comes down to the micro. It comes down to living as an individual in this world and trying to live a life that is aligned with the values and the principles and the awakenings that we care about. So that's the general structure. I will keep you updated on any other developments, and until next time, peace.